Hi everyone again. My name is Mukami. I'm the moderator for this webinar. Thank you for joining this discussion, and thank you to our panelists too for joining. So first I'll invite Humphrey Sipala to give his opening remarks.
My name is Humphrey Sipala, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Kabarak University Press. We are quite honored to be hosting you here. Very, very honored the sacrifice for the panelists who are speaking to us very early in the morning and very late in the evening. Thank you so much, especially to be hosting a panel of Global South thinkers to explore a topic in international law that I think is dear to the Global South. If you permit me, just a few thoughts about the right to development. The right to development has kind of, in a sense, for my thinking, lost steam as the decades have gone since the early years of the post-colonial era, the decolonization period of the 1960s. There was a very strong sense among scholars and thinkers and even states in international law that to redress colonialism, development was a key component. It was part of conversations about a new international economic order, and it proposed a radical rethinking of the nature and structures of international law. I'm particularly drawn to the thought of Doudou Thiam. Doudou Thiam was a Senegalese foreign minister. Actually, was Senegal's first foreign minister, 1960 to 68, with a blip in 1962. He was also a member of the International Law Commission for quite a long time, and was in fact the special rapporteur for the draft code of crimes against peace, the peace of mankind, which later on we know became the international, had the antecedents of what became the International Court of Criminal Court. But he was very particular about his views on the right to development in the early 60s. As foreign minister of Senegal, in 1967, his speech to the conference of the G77 group of states that was meeting to discuss the Charter of Algiers, he had very strong ideas about what the right to development should be. Allow me to read a bit. He says, just as in the developed nations, the rights to education, health, and work have been proclaimed for individuals, we must loudly proclaim here, for the nations of the third world, the right to development. What does this right imply? Doudou Thiam asks. He says, it is first and foremost a demand. We must denounce and reject all practices, all rules, all institutions which govern international economic relations. And here's the kicker. This is his kicker. To the extent that these, meaning the rules, the practices, the institutions, hinder the harmonious development of humanity. In 60 odd years since this time, there have been quite a number of iterations of what the right to development can be. But I think it's always great to refresh our minds about that radical idea in the beginning. The new international economic order and the demand for an international law that advances humanity. To discuss various aspects of what the right to development is, happy to have a panel of scholars who've been researching on the question, practicing on the question, and actually advancing the topic. And Kabarak University Press is honored to host all of you and our audience. This recording will be up on our YouTube channel, so you can always refer back to it. So thank you very much. I'm happy to listen in. Thank you. Thank you, Mukami.
Thank you for your opening remarks. Yes, indeed, the right to development is important to humanity in general. And yeah, it's also a crucial right under international law. So before I invite the first speaker, just a few guidelines to the audience. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function to raise it, or if you'd like to speak, raise your hand and we can give you the floor. So our first speaker for this webinar is Prof. Mihir Kanade. Prof. Mihir is a professor and department chair in the Department of International Law, University for Peace. He's also the chair for the drafting committee on the proposed right to development and a member of the expert mechanism on the right to development. So Prof. Mihir will be tackling 3 broad questions, and these are: what are the core elements of the right to development, and how do this interlink with the implementation of sustainable development goals? The second question is, what have been the key milestones and challenges in formulating the draft covenant on the right to development? And also, what innovations has the draft covenant put forward in international law? So, Prof. Mihir, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Yep, thank you very much for this kind invitation, and it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I've been posed with certain specific questions, so I tried to bring them together in this very short PowerPoint. But just to begin to say that, as Humphrey mentioned, we stand on the tall shoulders of a very important legal scholars, Dudu Thiam, Keba Mbaye, and many others who have been very instrumental in the evolution, the trajectory of the right to development. And where we stand today, of course, we have now moved towards a monumental moment in the history of international law, human rights law, where we are on the cusp of a new draft international covenant on the right to development and its adoption. I titled this short intervention as making human rights truly universal, because I think the major contribution of the draft covenant and the right to development's normative framework, in fact, is to make human rights truly universal. And by that, what I mean is that it is a myth that today we have the human rights framework, which which masquerades as a universal framework, but it simply is not. Because if you take a look at the linear account of contemporary human rights, it is deeply Eurocentric. It traces its origin to the European Enlightenment and the concept of modernity during the 17th and 18th century, where ideas of John Locke and Immanuel Kant, for instance, were actually used to justify colonization. And of course, they focused on a very particular kind of ideas of human rights, which were based on the separation of the human from the church. And that led to what we today have as the idea of individuality of rights. And I'll come to this point. But this linear account begins with modernity, and then to the American and the French declarations in the late 1700s, where people protested against the monarchies to say that, well, the concentration of power should not be with the monarchies, it should be with individuals. And then, of course, in 1948, we have the UDHR, which stands on these ideals of modernity and the American and French declarations. So what are the common elements of this Eurocentric perspective of human rights? The first is individuality of rights, right? Human rights are individual rights. The idea of collective human rights is not accommodated in this idea. The second is prioritization of civil and political rights over, of course, economic, social, and cultural. And this sits very well with the idea of the separation of the human being from the church or from the state, in fact, as well. The third is duties under human rights frameworks lie only on states. So there are no duties on non-state actors, because the whole idea is that human rights are a response to the abuses of the state, right? That's the idea within the Eurocentric perspective. And fourthly, the obligations of states are predominantly internal within their own jurisdictions. There's no duty to cooperate with the other states. And if you take a look at the European Convention on Human Rights, you find that it pretty much follows this Eurocentric vision of human rights. So you'll find that all rights in the European Convention are individual rights. They're all civil and political rights, no economic, social, and cultural rights. Duties are only on states, no duties on non-state actors, and predominantly also internal obligations of states. Now, contrast this with the Asian, African, and indigenous concepts of human rights. Now, clearly, despite what we may want to call it, there was, in fact, very little inclusion. There were contributions in the drafting process, but there was very little inclusion of alternative or non-European concepts into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that were based on collectivism, cooperation, and duties. So one simple example of that would be that although the United Nations Charter stresses on self-determination of peoples, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights contains no references whatsoever to the right to self-determination. Okay, it was later on included in the covenants on civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural, but the UDHR itself doesn't contain any references to the collective right of self-determination. So the starting points, I think, are very important. And I would like to stress this to the entire audience, that in a Eurocentric perspective, the starting point for understanding human rights is that we all have human rights by virtue of a very human embodiment, and these rights are exercised against the state. In alternate collective society, owe duties to the other, duties of good behavior, mutual respect, coexistence, and therefore the other person has human rights, right? The starting points are very different. It's not that I am a human being and therefore I have human rights. No, the starting points are that I have duties to the collective and therefore the other has human rights. And this is reflected in African concepts, for example, of Ubuntu or Firutuma. Ubuntu, as we all know, is I am because we are, or we are because I am, and or the Firutuma, which is the concept of duties to each other, which is distinct from a concept of charity in the African context, which is called Sunbu, right? And you have these concepts of duties to the collective also in other traditions, whether Hinduism, Buddhism, or Islam. So if you take a look at the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, there are certain characteristics which are distinct from a Eurocentric perspective. We have rights of individuals, but we also have people's rights, right? Right of peoples to development, to peace. We have equal attention to civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. We also have an entire chapter on duties of individuals, which you don't find in the European Convention on Human Rights or in international law. And you also have a heavy focus on the duty to cooperate. If you take a look at the American Convention on Human Rights, we have all of these except a reference to collective rights, but the jurisprudence from the American Convention, from the American Court of Human Rights, unlike the European Court, has recognized actually the collective rights quite a lot, particularly in the context of indigenous peoples, but not only. Now, the trajectory of the right to development. We come to 1950s and 1960s. Of course, there was a lot of disillusionment of the newly decolonized countries of the South with the world order that they were born into. And as Humphrey mentioned, this led to the push for a new international economic order and eventually to the recognition of the right to development in 1986. Now, a major recognition in this declaration of 1986 was that obstacles to the realization of development as a human right, or generally, do not arise only from the lack of an enabling national environment, but there are also obstacles that emanate from the international environment, right? And unless these obstacles are eliminated, it is not possible for any country on its own to realize development as a human right. Now, this was a monumental achievement in 1986, and the sole reason why we reached the adoption of the declaration was the numerical majority of the newly decolonized countries. By that time, they had gained a majority at the General Assembly, and so they could push forth their vision of human rights. But since then, and I would say till date, there has been a long drawn process for its operationalization, which has really been unsuccessful. The real momentum, the catalyst for the new draft covenant on the right to development was the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2015, where countries realized a couple of years later that unless there is international cooperation, we can't really realize the 2030 Agenda. And I can talk a bit more about this in the Q&A session because I authored the report to the Human Rights Council on operationalizing the right to development in the context of 2030 Agenda and what the problems were. Now, based on this, the non-aligned movement, which is a grouping of the Global South, decided that it's time now that we have had enough of talk about operationalization. But unless there is a legally binding treaty, nothing's going to change. So in 2019, they set in motion the process for the elaboration of a treaty on the right to development at the Human Rights Council. I was appointed as the chair of the international drafting group of experts. And of course, this process took about 4 years. But in 2023, the final draft was adopted, was forwarded rather by the Human Rights Council to the General Assembly for its adoption. And since October 2023, we have it before the General Assembly. And if my indications are correct, the draft will come up for discussion later this year. And it might even be this year that the treaty is actually adopted. Now, finally, I just want to highlight some of the very important gaps in international human rights law that are filled in by the International Covenant on the Right to Development. Both individual and people's rights are covered. So it kind of addresses one major lacuna in international human rights law in general, which focuses on individuality of human rights. And I should say that even Article 27 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, which is the rights of minorities, is not a collective right. Even that is framed as an individual right. So it does address a major gap. Obligations on states are recognized under this covenant, not only internally within your own jurisdictions, but also extraterritorially and collectively. As I pointed out, many times obstacles to development are not necessarily because of a lack of an enabling national environment, but these obstacles emanate from the outside. Conditionalities of IMF loans, World Bank loans, conditionalities on bilateral development aid, rules of international trade. So many different obstacles that emanate from the outside, unilateral coercive measures, subsidies that are illegal given to farmers in another country, in let's say the United States, harming farmers in Mali or Burkina Faso, right? So these obstacles emanate many times from the outside. So obligations in this covenant are recognized internally, externally, and collectively. There are specific provisions on the state duty to cooperate. It's always been part of international law, but somehow deprioritized. Now, this treaty brings it to the forefront. There is prohibition on states to require an international organization to adopt policies that undermine the right to development. So when countries vote at the World Bank or the IMF on the conditionalities of loans, there is a specific provision that addresses that. Obligation of home states to regulate, but this treaty really creates some sort of a fait accompli on recognizing that even home states of corporations have the duty to regulate their conduct when they operate extraterritorially. Duties of everyone, including legal persons such as businesses and international organizations, to respect human rights. As I pointed out previously, under Eurocentric perspective of human rights, only states have duties. Businesses have no duties. International organizations have no duties under international human rights law. This treaty settles that proposition and says everyone, including legal persons, have this duty to do no harm, at the very least, to respect human rights. There are specific provisions that recognize the obligation on international organizations to refrain from conduct that aids, assists, directs, controls, or coerces a state to breach any obligation that the state may have with regard to the right to development. So it sets the basis, and there's a specific provision on human rights impact assessments. It sets the basis for international organizations like the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization to be required to conduct human rights impact assessments for the conditionalities, for the laws that they may be adopting. And finally, states parties also reaffirm that the United Nations and its specialized agencies, which include the IMF and the World Bank, are under an obligation to promote the right to development. So, to conclude, what I would say is that this treaty is essentially aimed at decolonizing normatively the current contemporary human rights corpus. And that's the reason why the treaty is also named as a covenant and not a convention. As you may know, there are two covenants, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. All other core human rights treaties are labeled as conventions. And there's no technical difference between these, but it's a symbolic, there's a symbolic reason why only the ICCPR and the ICESCR are referred to as covenants. And so that's the reason why we label this as a covenant, to bring it at par with civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, and to become a part of what we call as the International Bill of Human Rights, which today comprises the Universal Declaration and the two current existing covenants. So, making human rights truly universal is the core objective of this treaty. The problem with contemporary human rights is not necessarily in what exists, it is these yawning chasms, what's absent from current human rights norms. That is the problem. And I think this treaty fills in those gaps by bringing the non-Eurocentric perspectives. Now, of course, this is only the first step, but I think it's a monumental step. We can't really have changes made on the ground unless there are changes in the norms. So with that, I'll stop, Mukami, and I'm happy to take questions at a later point.
Thank you, Professor Mihir, for those insightful reflections. You mentioned that the right to development evolved from a decolonial perspective, and this is also seen in its evolution, where you have movements such as the New International Economic Order emerging, and now we also have the draft covenant that, as you say, is trying to include this other non-Eurocentric perspectives. So building on this, I'm going to invite Prof. Eslava to give insights on the right to development and TWAIL, and he'll be tackling two broad questions, which are: how does the right to development fit into TWAIL's broader critique of international legal structures, and how do power structures influence the definition of what constitutes development? Prof. Eslava is a research professor of international law at La Trobe University, a professor of international law at Kent Law School, and a member of the academic circle on the right to development. Prof. Eslava, you're welcome.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for hosting this important conversation at this particular moment. With Mihir, I consider that what we are witnessing is a very important moment for both international law and world politics. Development, let alone the right to development, are crucial pieces in the global jigsaw puzzle of how what has happened up to this point, and what will happen, particularly at a point in which we are not only facing an environmental crisis, but also a civilizational crisis of sorts. And the question of how we rebalance the maldistribution of resources is critical in this context. So I would like to say just a couple of things about how we think about the right to development and how we conceptualize the efforts to adopt the covenant on the right to development within the larger conversation about international law and empire, or international law the European world in which we continue to exist. I think the first kind of broad point is something that often is not discussed, and is the way in which the global distribution of resources has been key to international law from its very inception, at least in the form of European international law. And here, when I think about the inception of that order, I refer back to the colonial encounter as it was formalized and then expanded across the planet, from the arrival of the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire to the Americas. And normally, when we today think about that inception of international law at that point, normally the questions that come up in our minds are questions about just war, the right to passage, and the different rights assigned to colonial powers and the obligations imposed without consultation to the peoples of the Americas. However, when you go and look closely, the nitty-gritty of the laws that began to be developed at that point, the question was how to distribute resources that were seen as freely available amongst the European nations, and which little rights were recognized to indigenous populations, and a whole series of justifications for the expropriation of those resources. Famously, this was kind of encapsulated later at the beginning of the 20th century of resources that were taken for the benefit of humankind, as it was stated in the Covenant of the League of Nations. Why they were taken from early on in Latin America, later, well, in the Americas, later in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, the resources were taken because they had to be distributed for the benefit of humankind. Who had the right to administer them? European powers. Who had to pay the price? The indigenous communities that were malusing or not using those resources. So when we think about through those kind of those lenses, distributing global resources has been central to international law, and been a sort of a silent but powerful project that has always operated in the background of the international legal order. First point. Second point, it is true, and no one can deny, particularly when we are now debating a Covenant on the Right to Development, or the draft of the Covenant for the Right to Development, that massive progress has been made. We not only have today a discussion about a covenant that builds on the 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development, which itself builds on a whole lineage, a whole kind of body of laws developed on the basis of efforts by third world nations, developing nations, to create an alternative international law. Mihir mentioned the new international economic order, which itself builds on the efforts of the non-aligned movement, which itself builds on the efforts of countries, Asian and African countries, when they came together in the Bandung Conference. But the developments are not only in terms of the evolution and establishments and proper adoption and embracement of the right to development, but also the 1974 New International Economic Order Declaration saw itself being updated and object of discussion for quite a number of years by thanks to a coalition of international activists and organizations, which itself a couple of years ago passed a program of action, what is called, and here I'm just reading the title to don't forget, and perhaps some of the people participating in the workshop would like to go and see it. The program of action on the construction of a new international economic order, it is really kind of outstanding work of global consultation about how to effectivize the new international economic order. So we have, developments in terms of the right to development, updating the conversations on the new international economic order. We have the fortune of having an UN special rapporteur on the right to development that is really fighting the fight and pushing very important topics on the agenda of debates about the new international economic order. And then we have countries in the global south, broadly defined, that have made a massive contribution, for example, in terms of the elimination of extreme poverty. If you take extreme poverty as poverty as one of the key concerns of the right to development. So we have China that single-handedly has eliminated, allegedly, extreme poverty in China, and which itself has contributed massively to the decreasing of extreme poverty at a planetary level, which is something that irritates massively to global north countries because they just want to contain what happens in China, but proportionally speaking, because of the demographics of China, it is a large part of human existing in this planet. Similarly, India has made significant progress in the elimination of extreme poverty. And then, today, global south countries have a much stronger and clearer voice in international negotiations. So all of that is good, and we cannot deny that. However, there are really a series of steps back that we cannot deny that are happening at the same time as we celebrate these developments. Just recently, as we all know, the United States withdrew, and has been already, even before Trump, withdrawing money from international organizations, support from international organizations. The Trump administration has cut severely, if not basically cancel US aid, which itself has created a crisis across the planet for international world. So the UK government has recently announced the largest cut ever recorded in international aid. And we have also silently breathing on the neck of many developing countries' governments a debt crisis. A debt crisis then is the direct result of decades of debt accumulation, which has gone after the pandemic. So basically, the challenge here is how to make sense of these two things. No? So an international legal and political order that has taken definitely steps forward in the realization of the right to development. And at the same time, we have a world that continues to struggle to distribute resources. The international law and scholars working under 12 are helpful. And one of the ideas that these scholars have played with is this fact that what we really call international law, international legal order, international law and development always should be taken with a pinch of salt, because what we have is not a unified body of law, but actually alternative political projects that operates through these bodies of norms and institutional formations. And for me, what I just described as this tension between kind of good things and bad things happening under the banner of the right to development causes an attention to the fact that what really, when we think about the right to development and including the proposed covenant, is we need to realize that what we're witnessing is different versions of international development or development at play, something that I will call kind of international development version 1 and international development version 2. And for me, the development version 1 or international development version 1 is a type of international development that borrows uncritically from a linear history, as Mihir was putting it, that sees development as and this is a project that will be realized if we play the game as global North countries have always proposed it, developing countries following the path of modernization and now, for example, sustainable development. And if we countries in the global south behave well and attain the norms and what they tell them, what international institutions tell them, development will be realized in those territories. But that form of development has proven again and again as being extremely limited. And limited when you compare with a development version 2. And that development version 2 is, rather than giving lessons about how to follow a linear path, conceptualize development as a battle. And it's a terrain of a struggle. Development is a terrain of a struggle that requires organization, collaboration, and cooperation amongst developing nations and groups and peoples of those nations in order to advance a version of development that really attains the needs and desires and ambitions. And I think when we look at the history of the right to development and the history of international law, we indeed see that kind of development version 2 at play. One of the reasons we always are frustrated with the no realization of the new international economic order, or with the little teeth that the Declaration on the Right to Development, the 1986 Declaration, has had, is precisely because it was the way, in essence, expressions of this development version 2 that irritated global North countries, and they generated a massive backlash, an incredible backlash, in the form of debt recovery, structural adjustment reforms, and the infamous Washington Consensus, more recently the Wall Street Consensus. All of these has been kind of counter responses, some of them coming from development version 1 to these more kind of combative forms of development version 2. So what is my invitation, or the invitation that comes for me out of the second point that I have made, is that when we think about the covenant, or the proposed covenant on the right to development, we first remember that it is, yes, indeed, another step in a long lineage of sort of progressive developments, and that it can be easily kind of subsumed into forms of development version 1, but that happens, or could happen, if we forget that behind it has been a whole history of political and legal organization by developing nations start trying to force that version of development and really attend the needs. And it's very interesting. It was very interesting to hear Mihir talking about it, and the way that Mihir emphasizes the progressive points of the covenant. And I think that's the points that we need to pay attention to and need to push when the covenant hopefully is adopted. Because for sure, there will be other interpretations of the covenant in which will emphasize all the limitations, all the problems, all the lack of teeth, so on and so forth, and will be insistent in just displacing conversations of the covenant within the more traditional economic, social, and cultural rights covenant. It will continue to emphasize, conversations of business and human rights that we know that don't take us very far, will kind of disable the possibility of mobilizing effectively the covenant within international negotiations around the debt crisis that will continue, so on and so forth. Again, thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Prof. Eslava, for those comments. I like how you've highlighted how central the distribution of resources is to international law and also to the right to development and how it's conceived. I think this sets the stage for Dana to come in and speak on self-determination, also given that self-determination is often conceived of even in terms of the right for people to determine their sovereignty over their natural resources. Dana, welcome. Ms. Dana Faraj is a PhD student at the University of Burgundy, a policy member at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and she will examine the concept of self-determination. Welcome.
Thank you, Mukami, and thank you for the invitation. I would like also to share a presentation, a short one. From the 18th century, the right to the self-determination emerged as a political principle with various interpretations, notably by Lenin and Wilson. The Lenin perspective stands on the Marxist understanding of self-determination within the collective rights of people as economic, social, and political self-determination, and not only on the political aspect of self-determination. In his declaration titled The Right of Nations to Self-Determination, Lenin emphasized the importance of self-determination for nations, arguing that it was a fundamental right. He believed that every nation should have the freedom to determine its own political status and pursue its own economic, social, and cultural development without external interference. This declaration was part of Lenin's broader revolutionary ideology, which sought to challenge imperialism and promote the independence of oppressed people. For Lenin, the meaning of self-determination comes through examining the historical economic conditions of the national movement, which means that the self-determination of nations is a political separation of these nations from the alien national bodies and for formation of an independent national state. So Lenin emphasized if a newly independent state is built upon bourgeois and capitalist relations, it can't fully eliminate the exploitation and oppression of nations. In other words, while self-determination may give a nation formal independence, it doesn't necessarily address the deeper economic inequalities and social structures that exist within the new state, particularly if the state itself is structured around capitalist interests. Now, moving to the Wilson or to the dominant discourse surrounding self-determination, while was primarily influenced by Woodrow Wilson's proposals, who was the United States president at the epoch, in his fifth point of the 14 points presented in 1918, I quote here, he said, "A free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of colonial populations and the colonial powers should be considered. And that territorial disputes should be resolved with the respect for the rights of the people involved." Then we can conclude that Wilson's explicit aim was to equate the powerful and the powerless, or as put by Lenin, the oppressor nations with the oppressed nations, and seemed to posit self-determination as a mask for the right of conquest. Therefore, his formula remained in line with those of Western imperial states. So Wilson supported at the epoch also the mandate system, which was adopted by the League of Nations in 1919. And I would say that it was essentially a support for a new way to justify colonial ambitions or imperial conquests. Thus, despite the different motives between Wilson and Lenin, both agreed on the centrality of self-determination for people. And since then, the common understanding of self-determination has been closely linked to the nation state that constitute its framework. So this concept was clearly established in the system of international law after World War II, as I will elaborate now. So the legal aspect of self-determination, I mean in the codification, rights, but we can see some shifts in the codification. So in the United Nations Charter, we can see that it was a principle of self-determination. And then there was a first shift talking about the self-determination as a right for the first time in the UN General Assembly Resolution of 1952, and then in Bandung Conference in 55, and also with the General Assembly Resolution on the declaration of the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. We have also another shift talking about the right to self-determination as a human right, and like saying that the self-determination cannot be achieved without collective human rights or like with all other human rights. I will not go in details here as it was already explained. And I will move to the evolution in the interpretation by the International Court of Justice for the self-determination in particular. So we can say that it was before firstly, as a self-determination developed as a foundational principle, as I just said, and then as a customary international law, basically in the advisory opinion of Namibia in 71, and then in the Western Sahara advisory opinion. And we have another shift talking about self-determination by the court as an erga omnes character, which is binding on all states in East Timor case, firstly, and then in the war advisory opinion, which was on the regarding the Israeli-built wall in the Palestinian occupied territory, and then aligning the self-determination clearly and directly with the decolonization, especially in the advisory opinion of Chagos. And then the progress or the great progress by the interpretation was in the latest advisory opinion of 2024 on the occupied Palestinian territory as considering the right to self-determination as a peremptory norm, which means that there is no derogation can be by any state. If we take now a look on the paragraphs by the court, we can see that in Namibia advisory opinion, which was asked by the Security Council, and this is also an important point because other advisory opinion were asked by the General Assembly, we can see that the court said that the presence of South Africa in Namibia should immediately be ended. And here also we can see a different way of talking about self-determination, I mean, a different way of framing the words court by saying immediately, because we will see that in other cases, it was ending the presence of such a power, a colonial power, as rapidly as possible and not immediately. In Western Sahara, we can see also the court talking about the self-determination as a right, and this was a progress by the court. Then in East Timor, as I mentioned before, it was declared as an erga omnes character, which is binding on all states. In the wall advisory opinion, it was the question itself was not framed on the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. However, it was on the wall itself as a violation of international law or as a breach of international law. However, the court declared clearly that the wall construction and all the associated regime to it is a violation of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. In Chagos advisory opinion, we can see that the court said that the process of decolonization of Mauritius was not lawfully completed when the country acceded to independence, and that the United Kingdom has an obligation to bring to an end its administration of the Chagos archipelago as rapidly as possible. And here, this is the emphasis that I wanted to say, that the court here said as rapidly as possible, which was the same case for the advisory opinion on the occupied Palestinian territories last July in 2024. And the court also said that Israel is under an obligation to bring an end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible. And here we can say that this is also related to the geopolitics and in different epoch, and also in who are the parties involved in such a case. In the first one of Namibia, we were talking about South Africa, which was declared and considered by the whole world as an apartheid state, and Namibia. So we can say that there were such a consensus on the way to frame the advisory opinion of the court, and it was easier to say that the presence of South Africa in Namibia should immediately be ended. However, in the occupied Palestinian territory and also in Chagos' advisory opinion, we can see that in Chagos, the United Kingdom was involved, which is also a member of the Security Council. So the wording and the way to frame such advisory opinions differ from case to another case, which is here as the involved parties is Israel, who is a clear ally to the United States. So we can see how the court said as rapidly as possible. But the important progress by the court here and by how it interpreted the right to self-determination is saying that it's a peremptory norm. And I want to just to reiterate what is a peremptory norm means. It's a peremptory norm of general international law. Jus cogens is a norm accepted and recognized by the international community of states as a whole as a norm from which no derogation is permitted and which can be modified only by a subsequent norm of general international law, jus cogens having the same character. So it gave a great weight to the self-determination by this advisory opinion, in particularly in the foreign occupation case. And this is also an important advancement by the court and progress, because before we were talking about self-determination in cases of decolonization and in cases of administration. But here we are talking about a foreign occupation, and also it was related directly with the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. I will stop here, and I'm happy to respond to any questions later on. And thank you again.
Thank you, Ms. Faraj, for that discussion. I will now invite Ms. Sandra Butcher to still expand the discussion on self-determination with a particular focus on self-determined development. Ms. Butcher is a judicial fellow at the International Criminal Court. Welcome, Ms. Butcher.
Thank you. Just building off what Professor Kanade said here, that, we sit on shoulders of giants. I would like to consider this to be an exercise of the continuation of this giants on whose shoulders we sit on, Dudu Thiam, Kebambaye, and for me, Professor Eslava, whose work has greatly influenced my thinking on development. And with that being said, though, I do have a few disclaimers. I was introduced as a judicial fellow at the International Court of Justice. I am not a member of the court, neither am I a staff, and so these members do not reflect these views I will talk about do not reflect the views of the court, and neither do I purport to speak on behalf of the court. So circling back to self-determined development, and if we examine Article 3F of the draft covenant, for us to analyze what is self-determined development, I think we need to first look at the dominant discourse on development. And for me, dominant discourse on development has been signaled by three things, focus on the economic modernity and emphasis on modernity. And I think also for me, modern dominant development discourse is intrinsically linked to the civilization project of colonization. And starting with this third point and moving backwards, modern development discourse is attributed to President Truman, who in his 1949 4-point speech said, and if I can quote him in part here, "The free people of Europe must resume their rightful place at the forefront of civilization and contribute to the welfare of the world." So granted, this is 1949 he's speaking in, and the context of this speech is rebuilding after the Second World War, but for me, this sets the foundation for development as we have come to know it, Development in this epoch and going forward until now wasn't necessarily a call for a distribution of resources, as Professor Eslava has spoke of, but rather it was a cementing of the current international economic world order. So the dominant discourse on development is not necessarily a leveling of the playing field or a distribution of resources, but rather it seeks to set in place what has already been there and things that we have seen from colonization understood as, a temporal, understood in the temporal to now. And perhaps an evidence of this or an example of this would be the 1948 Conference on Trade and Employment, running parallel to discussions on the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. So for the 1948 conference, we had developing countries having a seat at the proverbial table and being able to influence provisions of the draft covenant or convention then, and to be able to have provisions that were favorable to them. But what happened then is when it came to states ratifying the Charter of the International Trade Organization, developed countries did not ratify it, and therefore the resultant International Trade Organization did not take place. And this was an organization that took into perspective developing countries' views and wants and needs at the time. And contrasting that to the General Agreement to Trade, Tariffs and Trade, developing countries were locked out of positions for the most part. And what happened that views developed countries that took the weight and had the say at the end of the day. And what we now have is a trade system that's played by the dictates of those who were at the table and set the rules, i.e. the World Trade Organization. But that's with regards to development or the dominant development ideology being part and parcel of the civilizing mission of colonization. On the second point of modernity, which is also closely linked to that of the civilizing mission, is that development is understood as modernization, as modernization, and this will then signal a departure from the backward methods of production to more production methods that are closely aligned to is also understood as being modernization. And if we understand development or dominant development discourse along economic lines, this means that there's going to be a departure from the subsistence into more of a commercial. So what we have seen even with the nation states, particularly for states that have gotten independence post 1949, states have got independence and have entered this development foray, and a mark of development for has been grand infrastructural projects. And we have seen the nation state adjust itself to make room for this notion of development, this blueprint of development that follows the civilized nations, aka the Western world or the global North. So the nation state, for the nation state, development was its duty, and development was centralized in this nation state. And we've also seen how the nation state has morphed to modern times with changes in development discourse. So we have in 1990, I think it was 1991, the World Bank issued this report, the World Development Challenge Development, which then saw a shift in how development is handled by the nation state. So whereas before this report, development was centralized, to be decentralized post 1990 with this report. And we have seen the entrance of non-state actors into we have seen the entrance of non-state actors into the development foray. I hope you can clear the network is a bit wonky, but I will continue and I can perhaps restate anything in the Q&A. So then we see also the increase of public-private partnerships, which has signaled not so much, we've seen increase of public-private partnerships, and we now know more terms such as the ease of doing business. The ease of doing business mainly signifies the ease of entry of global capital into the nation state. And for me, then, what Article 3F of the draft covenant signifies is a departure from all of this, a departure from development being understood as a civilizing mission, development as modernization, and development as understood only along economic terms. It's also a step for me in decolonizing this dominant development discourse. And as Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote when he was talking about colonization, for him, colonization was a dismembering. And so decolonization would be an act of remembering. And so drawing parallels to colonization and dominant development discourse, I think Article 3F of the draft covenant is definitely a call in decolonization. And it's also a step forward in the realization of the right to self-determination, which is intrinsically linked to the right to development. And to close off, I think most importantly, Article 3F for me is an implicit reminder of who the duty bearers and the holders of the right to development are. So Article 3F implicitly recognizes, and this has been also recognized in other parts of the draft covenant, that it is truly individuals and peoples who are the right holders of the right to development. And the role of the state is the guarantor and the entity that affirms and realizes this right on behalf of individuals and peoples. And so flipping onto the other side of what could challenge the realization of the right to development, I'd like to link this, whatever I would say here, to what Dana has said. And because the right to development is intrinsically linked to the right to self-determination, then anything that would threaten the right to self-determination would also be a threat to the realization of the right to development. And in current global affairs, I think one of the major threats to self-determination is climate change, which would also then pose a challenge to the right to development. And I think we also have the usual suspects of neocolonization and economic imperialism. However, I think the nation state could also pose a challenge to the very realization of the right to development. If we look at Kenya, for example, we've got the nation state of Kenya almost usurping the right to development of certain peoples. The Ogiek, for example, and the Endorois people, whose cases have been heard at the African Commission and the African Court. And so what I think is important that this draft covenant does is that it sets in place the role of the state. As Mr. Sipala talked about this earlier at the beginning of this workshop, we have people like Dudu Cham and Kebambaye who stated categorically that the right to development is a right of peoples, a right of individuals and peoples. But we've had, particularly with the emergence of the right to development in the late 90s, a section of scholars, particularly in the Global North, who opined that the right to development is also a state right, but what the draft covenant does is set right this ideology that the right to development is primarily an individual right and a people's right, and the role of the state is merely guaranteeing this right, also recognizing this right, promoting and fulfilling this right, and being the entity for which peoples and individuals can recognize this right. So those are my views on self-determined development vis-a-vis the nation state and the right to self-determination.
Thank you, Sandra, for that insightful discussion on self-determined development and the nation state. So you mentioned that climate change is one of the factors that impede the right to development and even self-determination. And this shows moving away from the dominant conceptions of development being only viewed in economic terms. What are some other factors or other non-economic terms in which we can view the right to self-determination and also the right to development, apart from just purely on economic terms?
I think the right to development, particularly recognizing also the right to self-determination as a facet of the right to development, it's a people's based right. It's a human focused right. And that is what this draft covenant to me seems to be doing. And I'd like to recall perhaps the words of, Professor Ali Mazrui, and he investigates, the triple heritage of the African, and he sees how in a means to modernize, we have this clash of cultures, and we're not even necessarily doing modernization well. And I think it's also Echevarria who writes that then, in an aim to modernize and be part of this dominant development ideology, what we have is nation states that are merely imitations. So circling back to non-economic terms of development, I mean, for me, who's to say that in Africa, we have to abandon, for example, living in huts to have skyscrapers as a signal of development, What if we continue having skyscrapers? We don't necessarily need, what if we continue having huts, But then I think this is where the right to public participation comes in, or as is noted in the covenant, it's popular participation. The people themselves know how to develop or what they need to develop. And I think this story told in modern NGO discourse that this NGO went to build, I think, a well somewhere, so people are well closer to this community, so people will not have to walk hundreds of kilometers, or was it 40 kilometers to and fro just to fetch water. And they built this well, and within a couple of months, this well was not being used. And when they went back to check on why it wasn't being used, the women who were the ones tasked in that specific community of fetching water, they said that, well, we don't want to use this well because the time we used to walk that 40 kilometers to the river to fetch water is time that we get away from our families, and we get to ourselves and to talk and to be in community with each other. And so the need for them wasn't necessarily that they don't need water. They did need water, but they needed other structures for their own well-being, And then what the NGO went and did was then to put street lights so that they're at least safe when they're walking the 40 kilometers to and fro to fetch water. But all I'm trying to say here is that development for me is people focused, it's human focused, and the people will tell us what they need for their own development through means such as public participation. This is why these means need to be structured within the nation state.
Thank you, Sandra, for that. So at this point, I'll remind the audience that the Q&A session is open. In case you have a question, feel free to post it using that function. So far, we have a question directed to Prof. Mihir from Elvis Mogesa, an undergraduate student from Kabarak University and also editor-in-chief of the Kabarak Law Review. Mogesa has two questions. The first one being whether you have experienced any backlash from the Global North diplomats in the negotiation process. And also, how relevant do you think the decolonial normative framework is in drafting conventions and treaties? Over to you, Prof. Mihir.
Thanks, Mokame, for that, and thank you to Elvis for that question. Before I address that question, I just want to piggyback on a point that Sandra made about self-determined development. And I think this is really the core of the right to development. If you take a closer look at both the 1986 declaration and the draft covenant, and also in the commentaries to the draft covenant, I go into quite some detail explaining this. is that development is not actually defined in the declaration or the covenant. What we say is that that development is described, not defined. And there's a difference between definition and description. In the preamble of the 1986 declaration, development is described, of course, as a comprehensive social, economic, cultural, and political process that aims at the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population and of all individuals on the basis of their active, free, and meaningful participation and the fair distribution of benefits resulting therefrom. Now, the reason why we say that this is a description and not a definition, because the authors of what development is are the rights holders. And this is very clear in Article 1, which is the definition of the right to development, which is that development is the right of all peoples. It's an entitlement to three things: the right to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy development. And we say self-determined development. So what development means is determined by individuals and peoples, the rights holders of development, not by the state, not by the international community, not by the World Bank, not by the IMF or the WTO. It's the rights holders who define what development means to them. And of course, it differs from context to context. What development means to an indigenous community here in Costa Rica might be very different from what development means to an urban community in, let's say, Mumbai, right? There's a huge difference on what development means to them. And I think this is quite central to understanding the right to development and its normative framework. I often said that the 1986 declaration was much ahead of its time. In fact, the very same ideas were propounded by Amartya Sen, the economist, in 1998 in his book Development as Freedom, where he essentially said the same things, that development is about the well-being of people, it's about enhancing freedoms, which the declaration had said in 1986. But of course, Amartya Sen, the economist, won even a Nobel Prize for development as freedom. But the 1986 declaration did not gain much traction in 1986 for a variety of reasons, and we can go into that a bit later. But it was dismissed as a third worldist, collectivist ideology rather than taken seriously. And of course, an indication of why it was ahead of its time is that even the concept of sustainable development emerged in 1987, 1 year after the 1986 declaration. And that's the reason why sustainable development is not mentioned in the 1986 declaration. But of course, it became important to do so and incorporate that in the draft international covenant. Now, coming straight to the question about the backlash from the global North diplomats. I have to say that the global North was largely represented through the European Union. The US did not participate directly in the negotiations. Canada did not, but the European Union spoke for the global North. And their positions were very straightforward. Following the Eurocentric perspective, they said, we don't accept the right to development if it also includes collective rights. For us, right to development is acceptable only if it is an individual right, only if it means that obligations of states are internal. We don't accept extraterritorial obligations, we don't accept collective obligations, and we don't accept obligations on non-state actors. Now, whenever they would point out that we don't accept collective rights, we don't accept development as a collective right, I would have many times African diplomats from Asia, who would come up because I was leading the legal negotiations for almost 4 rounds of that. They would come up and express, they were infuriated because what it signaled to them is that only our perspectives, Eurocentric perspectives of human rights matters. Your perspectives of collective rights are not worthy of being elevated or accepted at the international level. And this was the general sense in the House, which was very frustrating because, it's a template of the Eurocentric model, which is being thrust upon the world as universal human rights. And it was this treaty that sought to kind of, the negotiations that sought to do away with that and said, no, look, there are alternative viewpoints from the other parts of the world as well. And it's not even alternative. It's not trying to dismiss the current international human rights legal order. It's trying to add on to it. With filling in the gaps, rather, to that perspective. So that was quite a serious discussion at the Human Rights Council in the working group on the right to development. But I have to say that there is power in numbers. The current Eurocentric model of human rights is basically because at its inception, the global North was in majority, much more in majority. Today, of course, we have a lot more. Today, we have a lot more countries from the global South who are in numerical majority. That's the reason why the Council managed to push forward the draft covenant to the General Assembly. At the General Assembly, the non-aligned movement and the G77 plus China are in an overwhelming majority, and I have very good reasons to believe that the covenant would be adopted, if not later this year, certainly next year. We have Uganda, who's the chair of the non-aligned movement and the G77, and they have taken a lead in pushing forth the draft covenant. And they are quite determined. The Global South is quite determined to have this adopted. Now, on that point about peoples, and I'll come to the second question immediately, very briefly. I would often point out to the European Union and colleagues from the Global North that please take a look at Article 1 of the two covenants. And Dana pointed this out, and Sandra also referred to it. The right to self-determination is a collective right. It's the only collective right in the two covenants. It's literally the fountainhead of all other human rights. And the reason why it's a separate chapter, a separate provision by itself, is because, and the very first article, is because it was quite understood by the time that unless you have the right to self-determination, even individual rights are incapable of being realized. It's simply not possible to realize that. But if you take a look at the language, all peoples have the right of self-determination, by virtue of which there's a reference to political dimensions, by virtue of which they are entitled to economic, social, and cultural development. The very idea of self-determination is the right of all peoples to their economic, social, and cultural development. And therefore, then for the European Union to come up and say that we don't recognize the right of peoples to development runs exactly contrary to very Article 1 of the ICCPR and the ICESCR, to which most of them are parties. Of course, the US is not party to the ICESCR, but it is to the ICCPR. So it militates against the very clear language of Article 1 of the right to of the two covenants. So there was this problem, and ultimately my sense of the whole negotiations was it's not the obstinacy of the European Union and the Global North had nothing really to do with international law and some sort of faith in international. It was more about maintaining a lopsided world order that has been maintained since or perpetuated since the time of colonization and now through neo-colonization as well. In terms of the second question, very briefly, I would say that it is quite important. It is the decolonial normative framework is extremely important in the drafting of these new treaties, whether it be the Framework Convention on Artificial Intelligence or tax evasion, or even the treaties such as business and human rights or transnational corporations, which is a huge mess. And I think it's a huge mess because they did not adopt the format that we did for the Right to Development Covenant. It's in a stalemate, but let's see what happens. But also others such as Plastic Pollutions Treaty or the Climate Change Treaty, because there is clearly not only a realization, but I would say a fact that most of these transnational problems cannot be resolved by individual countries on their own. There is a need of international cooperation, right? Without international cooperation, you can't have it. And of course, how do we look at international cooperation? The business as usual model has been of cooperation as charity. And that is the reason why it's failed. So unless international cooperation is conceived of and operationalized as a duty rather than as charity, we would continue to face the same problems that we have always had. So I think it's fundamentally important for this decolonial human rights perspective to be mainstreamed. And I have to say that the Global South has been too passive thus far. A much more muscular and proactive approach needs to be adopted. They have the numerical majority, and it is time that the Eurocentric perspective or viewpoints of human rights are not just challenged, not just academically challenged, but normatively modified to make it truly universal.
Thank you, Prof. Mihir, for answering those questions. So I'm going to invite Dana as well as Prof. Eslava to give their thoughts on the question and also on some of the answers that you provided. So beginning with Ms. Dana, welcome.
Well, thank you again. For me, I think that the progress of international law has been clear by years. It was like a progress step by step, and it was also by the pressure made by African states, by Asian states, by the oppressed people. They influence the progress of international law. And I think also that international law by itself still inadequate to solve any like problems of the world by itself, because international law comes also with politics and with the interests of powerful states. So we should look at it and give it the weight that could it have. And don't think that international law can resolve all problems of the world, like the de-development, for example. We can't say that it will be resolved, or the hegemony that is posed by powerful states on other states of the world, it can't be resolved by, for example, a convention. It should be also through a process itself by the people themselves, as Sandra was mentioning. So it's a process of coming in parallel, power, politics, and international law, the interpretation itself, and how states contribute to this progress and to the implementation and the enforcement, which is the most important thing, the enforcement of these tools of international law. Yeah. And thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you. Prof. Eslava, in comments.
Thank you so much. There's a point about the challenge posed by Sandra and that Mihir insisted on, which is the uncomfortable position of the national state or states in discussions about the right to development. Because of the history of tyranny, and because of the history of dictatorships in the global south as well as in the global north, because of the way in which national governments and local governments and bureaucratic apparatuses tend to align themselves with the global north, we are rightfully distrustful of them. And when we think about development, and our impulse is to call for an attention of the peoples that are the right bearers of right to development. But now I think we need to also recognize, within the context of international law, and particularly at this point where there's such a denial of truth and a call for deinstitutionalizing politics, about the risk that carries when we basically argue for a right to development for peoples full stop. And I think that's the challenge ahead in the remainder of the 21st century and ahead is how to create institutions that really speak of and represent the interests of peoples in their diversity. And I think that's the in a sort of way that's the real challenge. Especially when we continue to organize ourselves in terms of diversity, and the value of diversity, and that shouldn't be denied. But how to do that without basically undermining the institutions that we have created to come together. And I think that's a very important, tricky challenge for Global South countries, because part of the colonial project has been to deinstitutionalize our societies and to replace them with puppets, and then that also look for advancing their own interest. And so if we really want to achieve true right to development that serves the interests of peoples, we need to develop something in between and new institutions in order to channel the interests of people on the ground. Thank you so much again for the invitation.
Thank you for your response. I have another question here too, and any of the panelists can respond to this. What do you think of, or rather, what are the development angles of the proposed disaster convention and the pandemic conventions, which seem to respond to problems that will first be solved by a meaningful right to development? I hope the question is clear, so perhaps you can start with Prof. Mihir.
Could you refer to the first convention? I heard the pandemic convention, but what was the first one?
The proposed disaster convention.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the problem is not with these, with the conceptions of these conventions. It's about what ultimately gets accepted, what ultimately leads to accepting, the collective obligations. The pandemic treaty is a very good case in example. During the pandemic, there was a lot of vaccine nationalism that a lot of countries from the global north adopted. And this included a bunch of things such as, preferential agreements with the vaccine producers so that the vaccines would first go to the developed countries rather than the developing countries. And, there are countries which procured vaccines up to 6 times their population. And many of those vaccines were simply, kept for booster shots, and up to 300,000 vaccines on one of these days, during in the United States simply expired because they were not used for booster shots, whereas the rest of the world could not have them. The World Health Organization had this COVAX facility, which was crippled because of all these practices and export control restrictions on vaccines that the developed countries adopted. They did not accept to even a temporary waiver to the World Trade Organization's agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, particularly for patents on vaccines and therapeutics. The Costa Rica had initiated something called the Technology Access Pool, which was basically an idea that vaccine producers could pool in their technology, such as mRNA, and then anyone who wishes to use that can do so without being worried about a litigation for violation of intellectual property. None of that happened, right? None of that happened. There was clearly a failure of what we call as the duty to cooperate. And in one of my statements to the General Assembly, I pointed out that we have been, even the Secretary General of the UN, the Director General of World Health Organization called this a moral catastrophe. Why should we be so circumspect and hesitant about saying that it's not just a moral catastrophe, it's a violation of an international legal obligation? These countries have committed a human rights violation. That's a powerful language, because the global north doesn't like to be identified as a human rights violator. right? To say that they have violated human rights, they have violated the obligation of or the duty to cooperate is a very powerful language, and we don't need to be hesitant in saying that. But what's most interesting, and this is coming to the point that question that was raised, is that the whole movement for a pandemic treaty, who signed on to it, who called for it? It were countries like France. Many of these countries that participated in vaccine nationalism led the call for the pandemic treaty, along with some countries from the global south as well. So it was almost like saying that we engaged in vaccine nationalism because there was no treaty that bound us, that prohibited us from engaging in vaccine nationalism. And if you want us not to engage in vaccine nationalism again, we need to have a treaty, a pandemic treaty, right? There is a lot of hypocrisy inbuilt in this sort of a framework. So in whether it's the disaster convention, the pandemic treaty, the plastic pollution treaty, I participated in the plastic pollution treaties negotiation last year, representing the human rights system of the United Nations. And the biggest disputes there were the usual ones. Who's gonna, who's gonna cover the costs, right? Because developed countries don't want to cover the costs. There's a lot of just transition that is required in developing countries, not only internally, but also between developed and developing countries. Now, think about the plastic pollution treaty, right? I mean, it's all fine to say and important to say that we need to, and to have a regulation about cutting down plastic pollution and climate change. But there are important financial requirements to do so. I participate often every year at Pretoria, the Center for Human Rights in Pretoria, in some advanced trainings on right to development and other matters. And there's a huge concern about financing for development. If you take a look at Africa, there is financing coming in for climate change, but it goes for mitigation rather than adaptation. The African continent contributes together, sub-Saharan Africa contributes to less than 3% of the global carbon emissions. Their problem is not mitigation, their problem is adaptation, desertification, floods. That's what they need the financing for. They're not the contributors to climate change, but majority of the financing goes for mitigation. Now, who's selling you the technology? It's not a grant. It comes with certain conditions. So I give you the technology for mitigation, but you need to buy it from us on loans. And you can't buy it from a company in India or China. You have to buy it from my company, right? So my taxpayers' money in Europe goes through this long circuitous mechanism called climate change financing, comes back to fill up my company's pockets. But on top of that, you still have to pay the principal amount with interest, right? So it's a double whammy in all of this. So one has to understand that these discussions, when we say decolonizing human rights, we really need to be conscious of what's happening there. How international law has been and can be used as a tool for neocolonialism, right? It's the same perpetuation of the lopsided status quo that has continued since the times of colonization and after the United Nations system as well. So when we say decolonization, one needs to be very, very aware of what's happening, of what really are the motives in these negotiations. And yeah, that's one of the things that I always tell the diplomats from the global south, that please look for what's really happening here.
Thank you, Prof. Mihir, for your response. Due to time, I'm going to request the rest of the panelists to limit their answers to at least 1 minute each. So, Prof. Eslava, you can take the floor if you have comments.
No, I think Mihir has said it clearly and powerfully. We really are engaged in the business of decolonizing international law. We should be very aware of what's going on, because what's happening on a daily basis doesn't happen fully exposed. It happens to these very obtuse ways, as the climate financing example of that Mihir gave us clearly demonstrated. So, thank you.
Thank you. Dana?
Well, I totally agree, as well as how international law have been used to colonial interests, and how we should continue our contribution to make it go in the correct way for the people's needs, and not in serving the companies and this powerful states. Thank you.
Thank you. Sandra, can give your comments.
Yeah, I think I agree with everyone else. And it's difficult for me to not be cynical, seeing the current global order, but not to perhaps be entirely doom and gloom. These conventions present a chance perhaps for the global north to cement, the current world order, but also for us in the global south. They give us an opportunity to tilt the scales as much as possible, And so for us, the call is to not only just preach decolonization, but to actually live it, practically in the negotiations, as one being present and being part of these negotiations, and also the things that we will negotiate as provisions in these treaties. May they serve our interests as global South states, but also the interest of our people. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been a really interesting discussion with riveting insights. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us and for staying this long. I really hope this has enlarged your perspectives on the right to development. I'd also like to thank our panelists for joining us. For some, it's really early where you're from, so thank you for making that sacrifice and joining us. So now we are going to conclude the webinar, and to conclude, I'm going to invite Esther Blessing Nasimiu, a student from Kabarak Law School, who will give the vote of thanks and ecumenical prayer. Blessing, you're welcome.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And on behalf of Kabarak University Press, it is my great honor to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our distinguished professors and esteemed scholars who have graciously spoken at today's webinar and have enlightened us. As Lorraine has pointed out, your profound expertise and your dedication has left an indelible mark on all of us. And thank you so much for your thought-provoking discussions, which has inspired us to rethink our collective responsibility towards ensuring that the right to development is upheld as a fundamental and universal human right in our various capacities. And we are truly privileged here at Kabarak to have had the opportunity to learn from such exceptional minds, and your contributions today have enriched our understandings and also has galvanized our commitment to advancing this cause in meaningful ways. And to all our speakers and audience, thank you for your time and your passion for this. And your voices are also very instrumental in building a world where development is not only inclusive, but is also equitable and just. And with that, let's believe and pray. Our Heavenly Father, we come before you this afternoon. We thank you for the gift of life. We thank you for the right to development. And as we finalize, as we finish this discussion, we pray that may you be with us, may you guide us, may you protect us, and may you guide us throughout the day. And it is in the mighty name of Jesus I have prayed and believed. Amen.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.